But you care about the victims, I presume, of your brother.
These are the questions I don't get into. Have a good day.
Welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to look at another tense exchange on Piers Morgan Uncensored, this time involving Lady Victoria Harvey and a discussion about Prince Andrew's connection to Jeffrey Epstein and the allegations brought forward by Virginia Giuffre. The conversation quickly turns heated as Piers pushes back on claims that the accusations against Andrew are fabricated and challenges Victoria directly on some of the arguments she's been making about the case. In the clip you're about to watch, you'll see Piers repeatedly fact-check statements in real time, especially around the authenticity of the well-known photograph of Prince Andrew with Virginia Giuffre and the broader claims about whether victims in the Epstein case are being taken seriously. As the debate continues, the tension rises even more when Victoria doubles down on her defense of Andrew and dismisses Giuffre's credibility, which prompts an even stronger reaction from Piers. So what we're going to do is watch this exchange together, and then once we've seen the full discussion play out, I'll break down what was actually said, what the facts are around the Epstein case and Prince Andrew, and why this debate keeps resurfacing whenever the subject of accountability for powerful figures comes up.
On the phone now is Mark Epstein, who was Jeffrey Epstein's brother. Mark Epstein, we did speak once before on Uncensored. I appreciate you joining me again. You expressed a view then very strongly that you believed your brother didn't take his life, that he had been killed in prison. Is that still your view?
Even more so now, with more release of some documents that we got a hold of. And there's a group of pathologists that are actually studying the autopsy results, as should have been done initially, because if you recall, when Jeffrey first died, the initial death certificate, because the death said pending further investigation, pending further study, which was never done. And this group is actually studying it, and they're concluding, and they're doing a report that will come out shortly that's being peer-reviewed for a number of reasons, where they're showing that this couldn't have been a suicide as they claim. And also, with the more documents we've been getting, things like the Dr. Roman, who did the actual autopsy, she said in her deposition afterwards that she was prevented or told not to take DNA evidence, and she was prohibited from going to the crime scene, which is highly unusual in these kind of cases. We also found out that the FBI lost a lot of the information on the videotapes because they switched out hard drives when they were warned not to do that, because when you switch out the hard drives when they did, it was going to lose a lot of the information. But they went ahead and switched out the hard drives anyhow. So they did lose a lot of information, video information. And there's more and more facts that, look, if this was a suicide, it would be pretty simple. There'd be no need for all these shenanigans and all this documentation. Also, I had requested a full report from the medical examiner's office because initially I only got a partial, and then after everything was done, I more recently requested the full autopsy results. And the DOJ, the Southern District of New York, prohibited the medical examiner's office from giving me everything. They redacted part of the file until, for a while, finally we were able to get it. But why? The question becomes, why all of the games? Why all the obfuscation? It just doesn't make any sense. And then when this report comes out, it will conclusively show that it was not a suicide. And then you got to start.
We were talking earlier about
then who killed him, or who had him killed?
Right. Well, they're legitimate follow-up questions if, as you say, it wasn't as it seemed. And hopefully they will continue to investigate that because there are so many conspiracy theories swirling about it. We were talking earlier about how King Charles III in the UK has a big issue, of course, reputationally with his brother. It pales into insignificance compared to what I imagine you've been through as Jeffrey Epstein's brother. What is life for you like as the brother of perhaps the most notorious person in America?
Well, my life is fine. I'm just getting a lot more calls from journalists and ask for, these kind of interviews. And I've told people I only talk about Jeffrey's death because I found that when I answer questions about anything else in the files, whatever I say gets misconstrued to fit somebody's agenda. So I no longer answer questions about the things in the files, which I really, to be honest, don't care about. I wasn't part of any of that. I'm not named in anything. And, And if anyone's in the files or something that's supposed to be getting into trouble for something, I have nothing to do with that. That's their problem, not mine. I don't want to be cold about it, but I have my own life. Look, trust me, it would have been a lot easier for me if I thought Jeffrey committed suicide. I could have then, mourned my brother and went on with my life. But instead, I'm
right. But when you say, yeah, sure. But when you say you don't care about the files, I mean, I presume you mean because you're not directly accused of wrongdoing in them, which is completely correct, and you shouldn't have to justify something that doesn't involve you. However, your brother is obviously, there's so much stuff in these files which exposes him as an appalling human being. My question for you would be, how much of this is new to you? I mean, do you even recognize
like I said, a lot
you're
of
seeing
it's
from your brother?
Jeffrey and I were not. I didn't see him for 7 years before he died. Although we were always in communication with phones and emails, so I didn't know what he was up to. A lot of the stuff that's come out is surprising to me. I wasn't aware of a lot of the stuff, and I'm going to say, like with him, even though he's my brother, that was his problem. And now that he's dead, it's not his problem anymore. So again, unfortunately, I really don't care, to be honest with you. I'm just concerned that my brother, whoever and whatever he was murdered. That's my concern.
But you care about the victims, I presume, of your brother.
These are the questions I don't get into. Have a good day.
Okay. Well, extraordinary. Not a difficult question to answer.
All right, now that we've watched that entire exchange play out, there are a few things here that really need to be unpacked carefully, because what you just saw wasn't simply a disagreement on a television panel. What you saw was a clash between two very different ways of dealing with uncomfortable facts. On one side, you had Piers Morgan pushing Victoria Harvey to acknowledge evidence that has emerged from the Epstein case over the years. And on the other side, you had someone who has spent years defending Prince Andrew, continuing to dismiss the credibility of Virginia Giuffre despite multiple pieces of documentation contradicting that position. And the first major point that Piers raised in that clip revolves around the now famous photograph of Prince Andrew, standing with Virginia Giuffre and Ghislaine Maxwell. That photograph has been one of the most widely discussed pieces of evidence connected to the allegations against Andrew for more than a decade. For years, some defenders of Andrew claimed that the image was fabricated or digitally manipulated. However, during legal proceedings and investigative reporting surrounding the Epstein network, the photograph was examined extensively. Court documents, witness testimony, and statements connected to the investigation have repeatedly treated the image as authentic. In fact, investigators and journalists reviewing the materials connected to Jeffrey Epstein's operations have consistently referenced that photo as part of the broader timeline of events surrounding Giuffre's allegations. But the photograph itself is only one part of a much larger story. The reason the issue has remained so prominent is because of the lawsuit that Virginia Giuffre filed against Prince Andrew in the United States in August 2021. In that civil suit, Giuffre alleged that Andrew sexually abused her when she was 17 years old, after she had been trafficked by Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. Prince Andrew has always denied those allegations. However, the case moved forward through the U.S. court system for several months, and in February 2022, the matter ended in a settlement. While settlements do not constitute an admission of guilt under the law, the agreement included a significant financial payment to Giuffre and a statement acknowledging her as a victim of Epstein's abuse. That outcome alone is why many people view the situation as extremely damaging to Andrew's credibility. And this is where the exchange between Piers Morgan and Victoria Harvey becomes so striking. Because what Piers is essentially arguing is that once documented evidence, legal proceedings, and settlements reach a certain point, continuing to insist that every victim is lying begins to look less like skepticism and more like denial. That is why he becomes visibly frustrated during the discussion. He's pointing out that the conversation cannot simply remain frozen in the same place it was 10 years ago, when many of these allegations were first emerging. Since then, a huge amount of new information has surfaced about Jeffrey Epstein's trafficking network. To understand the scale of that network, you have to remember what happened in the criminal investigations. Jeffrey Epstein was first convicted in Florida in 2008 for soliciting prostitution from a minor, a case that later became controversial because of the extremely lenient plea deal he received. More than a decade later, in July 2019, Epstein was arrested again in New York on federal sex trafficking charges involving minors. Federal prosecutors allege that he operated a system in which underage girls were recruited and abused at multiple properties he owned, including residences in New York, Florida, New Mexico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Epstein died in federal custody in August 2019 while awaiting trial, but the investigations into his associates continued. One of the most important figures in those investigations was Ghislaine Maxwell, who had long been described as Epstein's close associate and facilitator. Maxwell was arrested in July 2020 and charged with multiple counts related to trafficking minors for Epstein. After a highly publicized trial in New York, Maxwell was convicted in December 2021 on several counts of sex trafficking and conspiracy. In June 2022, she was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. That conviction confirmed in a court of law that Epstein's trafficking operation did exist and that minors were abused within that network. That fact alone is why the credibility of victims like Virginia Giuffre has been taken far more seriously over time. Now, when Victoria Harvey argues in the clip that some accusers were not legitimate victims, she is echoing a narrative that has circulated among certain defenders of Epstein's associates for years. The problem with that argument is that multiple independent investigations by journalists, prosecutors, and courts have established that many of the women who came forward were indeed abused as minors within Epstein's system. Giuffre herself has provided testimony in several legal proceedings and has been interviewed extensively by investigative reporters documenting Epstein's network. Her allegations have remained consistent enough over time that courts allowed her civil case against Prince Andrew to proceed before it was eventually settled. Another point that Piers raises in the clip is the issue of accountability for powerful people. This is really the broader theme underlying the entire conversation. Jeffrey Epstein's case shocked the world not only because of the crimes themselves, but because of the enormous number of wealthy and influential figures who had social or professional relationships with him. Over the years, journalists have uncovered connections between Epstein and politicians, billionaires, royalty, and celebrities. In many cases, those relationships turned out to be purely social or professional. But in other cases, investigators found evidence that Epstein used his wealth and influence to surround himself with powerful allies who helped shield him from scrutiny for years. That's why debates like the one you just watched become so heated. For many observers, the Epstein scandal is not just about one criminal network. It's about the broader question of whether elite institutions hold powerful people accountable in the same way they hold ordinary citizens accountable. When someone like Victoria Harvey dismisses victims entirely, critics argue that it reinforces the perception that certain social circles protect their own, no matter what evidence emerges. And Piers Morgan, despite often being a controversial figure himself, is clearly pushing back against that idea in this clip. What he's essentially telling her is that there comes a point where refusing to acknowledge documented facts becomes untenable. The Epstein case has already led to criminal convictions, civil settlements, and extensive investigative reporting. Pretending that none of it happened or that every accuser is lying simply doesn't align with the record that has been built over the past decade. Another detail worth noting is the way Piers challenges Victoria on her language toward victims. Throughout the Epstein investigations, one of the most consistent criticisms from victims' advocates has been that survivors of trafficking often face intense public attacks on their credibility. When prominent commentators accuse them of fabricating their experiences, it can discourage other victims from coming forward. That's why Piers says he finds her comments repellent. He's essentially arguing that dismissing alleged victims outright without engaging with the evidence contributes to a culture where powerful individuals avoid scrutiny. And this is why the broader Epstein story continues to generate so much attention even years after his death. The case raised fundamental questions about how influence, money, and social status intersect with the justice system. Many people believe Epstein was able to evade serious consequences for decades precisely because of his connections with wealthy and influential individuals. When new revelations about those connections appear, public interest spikes again because people want to know whether anyone else will ever face legal consequences. Now, whether someone believes Prince Andrew committed wrongdoing or not, the key fact remains that the allegations against him became serious enough to trigger a major international scandal. He stepped down from royal duties in 2019 after the controversy intensified, and in early 2022 he lost his honorary military titles and royal patronages. Those decisions were made by the British monarchy itself, which demonstrates how damaging the situation had become for the institution. So when you look back at the exchange between Piers Morgan and Victoria Harvey, what you're really seeing is a collision between two competing narratives. One narrative insists that the accusations against Andrew are part of a broader smear campaign against powerful figures connected to Epstein. The other narrative argues that the evidence that has emerged over the past decade, including court cases, settlements, and criminal convictions, makes it impossible to dismiss the victims' accounts outright. And that tension is exactly why discussions like this remain so explosive whenever they appear on television panels or online commentary shows. Because the Epstein scandal touches on some of the most sensitive issues imaginable: abuse of minors, the influence of wealthy elites, and the question of whether justice applies equally to everyone regardless of status. So after watching that exchange and hearing the arguments from both sides, I'm curious what you think about it. Do you believe the criticisms that Piers Morgan raised about the evidence in the Epstein case and Prince Andrew's settlement? Or do you think the defenders of Andrew still raise legitimate doubts about the accusations that have circulated for years? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. And if you found this breakdown useful, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next analysis.